Are there certain forms of work that are more human than others? Are there kinds of jobs that Christians can't or should not do? And what does the ennobling of work have to do with belief in God, participation in the sacraments, or the life of prayer and contemplation we're called to live in imitation of Christ?
Good to see faces here. End of the semester. It's good for you to come. And if you feel a little like me, I'm jet lagged. Came back on Sunday from a long flight, Sunday evening. And so I walked by this picture on the slide here numerous times, and I had no idea what the picture was of. I was so confused. I kind of like the colors. And I finally got it. Looking at it, I'm like, oh, that's pretty clear. We've got working for beauty, and we've got the workers, you know. And so I hope that Dr. Henderson's talk is going to be clear enough that you can understand this picture too. Tonight's paper is Working for Beauty, and it will theologically explore many notions, but some key notions being dominion and work. Both notions are somewhat suspect these days. Dominion seems to be at the heart of the ecological crisis, and work is seen as a necessary evil that one must do in order to retire. Yet, the error in this way of thinking lies in a misunderstanding of dominion and the fact that dominion and work have been separated. Turning to Genesis, Romano Guardini, great Italian-German theologian, makes clear that dominion is not sheer power, but is relationally conditioned. Man's dominion is to be a reflection of God's lordship. After all, man is created in the imago Dei. Guardini writes, man is to take responsibility. In appropriate activity, we now have to penetrate the new thing so as to gain mastery over it. We have to become lords of the unleashed forces and shape them into a new order that relates to humanity. The problems we face today are not because of man's dominion, but because of the lack of man's dominion. I hope this aptly sets a stage for what is to come. We'll find out. But now let me introduce you to our speaker. Dr. David Henderson. I get to work with him on a regular basis and just had the pleasure of having dinner, and he always has insightful things to say. He is a native of the Lower Mainland, received his BA in Christianity and Culture from Trinity Western University. He also holds a master's degree in theology from Regent College and a doctoral degree in a doctorate in moral theology from St. John Paul II Institute for Marriage and Family at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. That's a mouthful. David has authored essays on ecology and sexual ethics and is an assistant editor of the online review journal Humanum. And you should check that out. It's a wonderful journal. Essays that are very readable and aren't too long, which is sometimes quite a nice thing. And both Dr. Henderson and myself have some pieces in there. And then there's much better pieces by other authors. Yeah. Having converted to Catholicism in 2013, David brings an interest for theological aesthetics, the conflict between ancients and moderns, and the ongoing reception of the Second Vatican Council. He currently lives with his wife and 3 children in Langley, BC, but soon he will be in Abbotsford. Would you please welcome to the stage Dr. David Henderson.
Hello, everybody. This is the part where I say I'm really great. It's really great to be here, but I'm always here. You're not. So thank you for coming. Thank you for being a part of our Catholic college, and thank you for the students for showing up. It's no small sacrifice at this part of the semester. I see a few of you that I guess we'll see how that works out in tomorrow's class, right? If readings get done, but here we are. So as Andrew has mentioned tonight, where's my clicker here? There we go. Yeah, just down there, just in case I need it. So as Andrew mentioned tonight, I sort of want to offer what I would call maybe the scaffoldings of a contemplation on the theme of work and the dignity of work based on the text of Genesis 1 and 2. And I'm going to propose this as sort of a founding, sort of anchor quote. Work is a fundamental dimension of man's existence on earth. Of course, taken by John Paul II's great encyclical on work, Laborem Exorcens. Work, in other words, accompanies our being creatures. For whether in the work undertaken in the mind or the labor of the body, the human person finds in work the very expression of his finitude. On the one hand, work manifests something of that aspiration corresponding to our spiritual beings. And by work, we demonstrate a faculty not limited by the way the world is, but open by way of our imaginations to what might be, or could be, or should be, according to the strength and efficacy of our interventions. On the other hand, work makes concrete the human experience of limitation and finitude, our being material beings, always and everywhere restrained by an order of reality that does not ultimately yield to our designs. Work is a reflection, an extension then of our dual or twofold nature. And therefore for us, work is never simply something we do, but it is who we are, expressed in the manner of action and achievement. And it is because work is an integral dimension of our human nature that we know how susceptible work is to the profound distortions of sin. The crisis of who we are as creatures passes through the question of work. And much of human history is dogged by this question of work's dignity and our place before it. And this is no less the case today as in ages past. So in his historical survey of the idea of work, Herbert Applebaum outlines two general postures before the human condition, between the human attitude that leads towards work's denigration. One is perhaps represented most by that of ancient Greece and Rome, whose attitudes towards work might best be described as disdain. Work, at least ideally for the ancient Greeks and Romans, was a task fit only for slaves, with the activity especially of manual labor and craftsmanship being regarded as a kind of necessary evil. As with Plato, human embodiment was seen as a prison, a reliance on mechanical, material means, a perpetual source of temptation and humiliation. There was one aspect of work that the Greeks and Romans deemed the most problematic, namely the change wrought by human labor on the natural order, as in the myth of Prometheus, who defies the gods by stealing the fire from Mount Olympus and giving to human beings this power to work. This power was always viewed by the Greeks as a kind of desecration, a violation, an intrusion upon a world that was better filled with a divine order and purpose rather than a human one. Thus, work always carried the risk of punishment. Zeus punishes both Prometheus and mankind for this transgression, rescinding the gift of vitality both from the land and the human body, so that both the physical labor in the fields and the embodied labor of producing children take on a tragic quality in Roman thought and life. As always, a hopeless attempt to restore to nature and oneself a vitality that is forever lost. One might be tempted to think that in our contemporary readiness to shape and transform our world, that modern thought has set aside this ancient disdain for work in favor of a more positive or optimistic assessment. We might especially think of those great philosophers of the Enlightenment, those like Francis Bacon, who so exalted the potential and prowess of human ingenuity as to liberate labor and empower human agents to take ever greater role in the shaping of the quality and trajectory of our lives. Yet, we today can perhaps intuit any number of indications that this, in fact, has not been and is not a genuine exaltation of work, but rather just another form of work's denigration. And indeed, we too have our accompanying myths that serve to unmask our underlying prejudices. Bacon gives expression to something of this modern myth in a short little essay entitled simply on gardens. The story he draws upon, of course, is the Christian story, as he expresses wonder at the provision of God's first placing human beings in the context of a garden. Gardens, according to Bacon, are the purest of human pleasures and the greatest refreshments to the spirits of men. For without gardens, we are told, buildings, palaces would be but gross handiwork. A point that Bacon does not immediately go on to explain, so taken is he by the manifold delights that a garden brings throughout the year. What does Bacon mean here, that without gardens, buildings, and palaces would be but gross handiwork? Well, you see, for Bacon, a garden serves as a kind of lure. It is an ideal that God assigns and sets before human beings as a monument of his created purposes. God, in other words, places Adam and Eve in the garden so as to communicate his desire that they be happy, their desires fulfilled, which for Bacon speaks of the provision of this world, and this world being sufficient for the attainment of human pleasure and satisfaction. But upon realizing this, Bacon's denigration of work thus becomes evident, for he is therefore not speaking of the actual activity of gardening as amongst the purest of human pleasures or the greatest of refreshments. This is an ideal that inspires work, given in a sense permission for human beings to set out and shape the world, but the mundane tasks of the labor itself, plowing, tilling, digging, planting, harvesting, are never mentioned by Bacon, and they are merely the provisional steps taken by human beings in pursuit of this goal. So separated from its spiritual ideal, such labor invariably becomes a kind of material drudgery, a burdensome yoke under which human beings must suffer in pursuit of some ever-distant utopian ideal. Whether in our cultural attitudes towards work and retirement, our pervasive reliance on technologies, employed, mind you, deliberately so as to replace human agency, or the increasing cynicism of our society toward the efficacy of human work in the world and in the environment, it is not difficult to perceive the presuppositions of Bacon's mythological garden still operating in the minds of people today. So that even if our views of work tend to be more optimistic than the ancient Greeks and Romans, they are no less tragic, and are perhaps even more so, insofar as it is in the Bacon materialist lens through which we look upon ourselves and our world that leads to a despairing view of human labor as an arduous, ultimately purposeless condition that we are regrettably powerless to overcome. From a Catholic perspective, this association between work and the broader spiritual discernment of human beings within a material cosmos represents something of a possibility. For if prevailing attitudes towards work serve as a kind of bellwether to our present cultural malaise, then the defense of work and its dignity reflect a possible avenue of transformation, indeed of conversion. And for those that know the efforts of the Church over the past 130 years in the formation of what is now known as the Catholic social teaching, we know exactly that this is the task to which the Church has set herself. From its inception with the encyclical Rerum Novarum by Leo XIII in 1891, to its most recent reiterations under Pope Francis with Laudato Si and Fratelli Tutti, the Church has, in recent times, come to see the defense of the dignity of human work as an essential facet of its evangelical mission. Whether in seeing the protection of workers' rights, promoting improvements to working conditions, upholding the justice of labor laws and a livable wage, supporting the formation of unions, or advocating for the responsible management of economic and ecological resources, the Church has, over the past century and a half, resisted the cultural hegemony of industrialized labor in favor of a vision of work and of man informed by fraternity, justice, and charity. Yet, however noble and important such efforts in social justice continue to be in the Church's witness before the world, Catholic social doctrine has at times been dogged by certain questions. Are there certain forms of work that are more human than others? Are there kinds of jobs that Christians can't or should not do? And what does the ennobling of work have to do with belief in God participation in the sacraments, or the life of prayer and contemplation we are called to live in imitation of Christ? Does work merely provide the occasion for the exercise of certain social, religious virtues? Or is work itself the source of these values, something through which we are given to discern the quality and character of our lives? Ultimately, these questions are all tied up in a single ambiguity. Is work something we do? The means by which we secure exercise or otherwise guarantee some other spiritual dignity? Or rather, is work something we are? Are we, a la Heidegger, beings at work? And is a proper working then something from which we receive our dignity as human creatures? Might we, in work, discern something as to what it means to be truly human? So I will this evening be proposing the latter option, and joining my comments to those of Pope John Paul II, who in his encyclical Laborem Exorcens sought to defend work as something fundamental to human identity. In his encyclical, John Paul II appropriately goes back to the beginning, back to the text of Genesis 1, in an effort to show how the human inclination towards labor itself works as a kind of divine communication or transferal of goodness, such that the human capacity for work becomes a defining feature of our dignity as a creature made in the image of God. As John Paul II writes, work is a good thing for man, because through work, man not only transforms nature, adapting it to his own needs, but he also achieves fulfillment as a human being, and indeed, in a sense, becomes more a human being. The heart of JP2's proposal here being that work, from a Catholic theological perspective, is a locus of our participation in God, a point of contact or communion in which human beings partake not just of a finite order, but an internal order of goodness and truth in the very mode of our remaining creatures. What I therefore propose for the rest of my time tonight is an expansion upon John Paul II's efforts in Laborem Exorcens, seeking a broader foundation for the conclusions he draws concerning the primordial dignity of human labor, but a more expansive treatment of the texts of Genesis 1 and 2. In truth, John Paul II's focus in the encyclical is quite narrow, nor does he make mention of certain difficulties referred to the text of Genesis that would stand in the way of a participatory understanding of human work. My proposal then is to present a kind of theological interpretation of certain key passages in the Genesis account as a way of lending further support for John Paul II's conclusions. These sites of meaning I list as image, dominion, naming, and then together garden and tree. And with these attempting to show how a symbolic appreciation for these principles serve to adjust our reading of Genesis as a text that does indeed illuminate and support the mystery of our work being a privileged point of encounter with the divine. For one could very easily be forgiven if, turning to the opening chapters of Genesis, one draws the conclusion that work, rather than receiving a central place and role in this account, is instead displaced as being a site of possible participation. For instance, the text of Genesis has, for the whole extent of the Catholic tradition, been understood to support the idea that God creates the world ex nihilo, or out of nothing. But one implication of this doctrine being that God creates without work, that there is, in other words, no effort, no labor undertaken by God in his creating the universe, no sense of his having to forge the earth from some sort of primordial matter or overcoming some competing force or deity. There is in the text of Genesis no background or foreground against which the supreme sufficiency of God's creating words can be measured. God speaks, and things are according to his word. But it is precisely this supremacy of word that reflects a problem for us as creatures. For this is then not an activity or a faculty in which we share. The way in which God acts seems to be so utterly removed from the manner in which we act as humans, that this scarcely supports any imagination for how our laborious agency amidst a material world can even compare to this manner of spiritual sovereignty and mastery. This issue as to our participating in God in work is further compounded in the narrative of creation's successive days, where even if one can ascribe to the various orders of creation a kind of divine outworking, namely of things and creatures going forth and carrying about their divinely ascribed paths and vitality and purposes, the text is also emphatically clear that no created thing contributes one iota of their effort to their own creation. The opening lines of Genesis, "In the beginning, when God created heaven and earth," are intended to convey this point, that God is the sole source and author of all there is, and thus no creature is capable of exercising any authorial control over the order and arrangement of this reality, whose laws are, as it were, ordained by God. Here again there arises a radical disproportion between human and divine agency, for every created thing derives their nature and manner of being from the wisdom of God alone. The problems or challenges to a participatory understanding of work only further multiply the more we read. While Genesis records human beings receiving a dominion over the created order by God in chapter 1, verse 28, this nonetheless receives a distinctly passive sense when later modified by chapter 2, verse 15, where Adam is placed in the garden with the instruction of tilling and keeping it, indicating that his dominion or authority over creation is perhaps more juridical or symbolic, rather than any kind of active or creative intervention. When combined with the account of his naming the animals, Adam's role in creation seems altogether passive, a mere seeing and describing, and to what extent this even amounts to a criteria of work remains unclear. This instance of Adam's naming only further leads to a problem, namely that the first task recorded be undertaken by any human being is one in futility. For Adam soon discovers that there is no such helpmate to be found amongst the creatures of the world, and that he himself has no innate faculty to remedy this situation. Again, Adam is rendered passive, into almost apparently a workless state, when God places him into a deep slumber so that he might fashion Eve from his side. The language of garden and the culmination of the creation in the seventh day of God's Sabbath rest only serve to reinforce the impression that creation was not ordered for man to work upon or in it, but something more inclined towards his rest and leisure. Indeed, the first explicit mention of labor occurs rather auspiciously with Genesis chapter 3, in which following Adam and Eve being cast out of the garden, Adam is then cursed to toil upon ground now deprived of its vitality, while Eve is cursed to labor and the pain that will now accompany her bearing children. In all of this, we are not led back to the are we not led back to the resentful attitudes of the ancient Romans and Greeks, or towards the utopian despair of a Baconian toiling? Here, work seems overladen with our sinful and finite condition, the product perhaps of our disobedience or ineptitude, but either way, something outside of God's creative purposes. So I want to offset this interpretation and impression. And I want to do so by turning to a book by an author by the name of Matthew Pajot. And his book is entitled The Language of Creation. A very helpful and insightful book as to how it is that the ancient authors of Genesis viewed and saw the world. Pajot begins his book by pointing out that we, as with any reader, approach the text of Scripture with a host of unexamined assumptions and presuppositions, and thus often pose questions to the text in search of meaning that were not originally a concern of its author. Pajot describes two such perspectives, the modern materialist perspective and the ancient spiritualist perspective. The materialist perspective begins with questions such as, how does it work? And what is it made of? And what effect does it have on its surroundings? Such questions, I would emphasize, are not unimportant, but they are, as Pajot points out, foreign to the thinking of the text's ancient author, whose purpose and designs are altogether different. One particularly pernicious outcome of our material reading of the text is that we today tend towards thinking things geometrically, which is to say, framed as though upon all sides by clear and distinct barriers. I won't explain what I mean by this yet, but it'll become apparent over the course of the talk. This, as Pajot points out, was not how any ancient author would have thought about the world, who had rather been taken up in a symbolic or spiritual perspective with an entirely different set of questions and concerns in mind. Where the materialist asks, how does it work? The spiritual perspective seeks to know, what does it mean? Where the materialist wonders, what is it made of? The spiritualist is concerned with what truth does it embody. Critical is how, from a symbolic perspective, the meaning or identity of a thing is not attributed to what uniquely separates that thing from everything else. What effect does it cause gets transposed into the question, from where and towards where does it derive its meaning? A thing possesses meaning only to the extent that it represents or reflects the character of some greater whole, a whole in which all other things also participate and find their meaning by order of degrees. With this in mind, I want to approach the elements of Genesis 1 and 2 just mentioned and see what this adjustment to our way of reading illuminates with regards to the question of work. Image. The account of Genesis 1:26 and the creation of man that records God saying, "Let us make man in our image, in the likeness of ourselves," is commonly misinterpreted through the lens of what distinguishes human beings or separates them from the rest of creation, whether from the inanimate objects of the celestial bodies or the animate objects of waters, or from the animal creations of the sea, air, and land. They are nonetheless thought to lack certain qualities that make human beings distinct. Human beings as persons possess qualities such as self-consciousness or a capacity for self-determination, or a faculty for reason. The danger here, however, is not that these interpretations are simply wrong or misguided, but only that they risk ascribing the significance of the creation of the human person to something that places them beyond the parameters of creation itself, outside of creation. Such interpretations from Pajot's perspective remain to be tempered or situated within the text's symbolic, spiritual meaning. For, as Joseph Ratzinger says, the word image does not foremost evoke in the ancient mind the idea of a capacity or faculty, but rather would have been understood through the lens of its physical manifestation. An image is a composite reality, one comprised of two principles that are brought together under the unity of a new being. An image from a symbolic perspective is therefore not the remote communication of some abstract likeness, as in the case of a digital photograph or a projected image on a video screen, that does not itself become impacted by the content that it receives, but is an event-like phenomenon in which a material principle such as wax or clay or molten ore is conformed in such a way as to bear the mark or likeness of some immaterial spiritual being, that is, the intellectual idea or form that it comes to represent. An image, then, is more fundamentally an order of relationship, one in which an unequal partner, the matter, is elevated or raised, as it were, through itself, so as to now also participate in something higher, spiritual, and greater. So where does this get us with respect to work? I would say a surprising distance, if one considers that the first problem of human work was to situate mankind within the broader perspectives of the divine work of creation. For in this case, we understand by the term image that human persons are not separated from the rest of reality on the basis of some faculty, nor are they merely static things, endpoints or achievements of God's creative purposes not related to anything else. Rather, as Ratzinger writes, the word image carries the sense of the human person being in motion, of not being closed in on themselves, but constantly open to what lies beyond them. This motion, moreover, is not simply is not theirs in the sense of a private possession, but but rather is the dynamism of creation itself. For as Pajot points out, the material and spiritual dimensions of the image ultimately point symbolically back to God's forging his creation out of those same principles, heavens and earth. So that by this, one understands that the very dynamism of the world's creation passes through and is taken up in the identity of the human being. The dramatic unfolding of the unity between spirit and matter that is creation is a task at once native to the human person and something towards which he is set in order of work. A task that is no mere job or occupation, but a work that man is, in the very manner of his image-like existence. The content or character of this work remains yet unestablished, and the question as to what human beings accomplish, if anything, in undertaking this task still looms large. Let's turn to our next area of the text in the term dominion to see what further insights we might yield. The most obvious point of inquiry to explore the question of the content of human work from a perspective of Genesis are those points of the narrative I've already mentioned, that of God bestowing human beings with an authority of dominion over creation, what this implies and how this authority is exercised, and Adam's task of naming the creatures, and how his doing this was a legitimate exercise of his authority. With the term dominion, John Paul II suggests that the term carries a twofold implication. In the first place, it describes the meaning of work in its objective sense. Here, the command to partake of food-yielding plants and to fill and subdue the earth is taken to mean a creative license of human beings to adapt or change those realities in service of some use. Creation is, in this context, subordinate to the stewardship and sovereign rule of mankind, who, as the only creatures created by God for their own sake, are given freedom to craft the created realities of the world in service of their own fulfillment and fruition. Notwithstanding the potential abuse of such work, John Paul II nonetheless confirms this vocation as an essential facet of human dignity, because it secures the sense in which human beings are irreducible to the material realities of the world. They possess a spiritual dignity on account of their receiving themselves from God. And he even here speaks favorably of man's technical management of earthly realities, seeing in technology at least a potential to find an ally in service of this fundamental task and mission. However, John Paul II is also fully aware that if left only to this objective or material sense, then one runs the danger of conflating the account of Genesis with a modern penchant for technological domination, in which an impulse to transcend one's environment leads to a destructive permissiveness and license toward other material beings. These beings are treated as replaceable, discardable, infinitely malleable, as human work here takes on the quality of an endless search for the greater, the better, and the more efficient. There is, in other words, a danger in a too materialist reading of the term dominion, that the character of work turns destructive, and where we become subject to the idealistic lure that so affected Bacon, one in which our work is directed towards ever more abstracted and otherworldly aims. For John Paul II, although the objective meaning of dominion remains true, the critical insight is that it is not the term's most fundamental sense. There is, he argues, a more comprehensive subjective dimension, one that importantly resists a dominion of control and domination. Simply put, to understand the term dominion in its subjective sense, it means to view the work assigned to Adam as being filtered or conditioned by the nature of his being a person. Dominion, in other words, is not some naked category of power or juridical authority, but rather arises, as it were, organically from Adam's peculiar dignity as a dynamic creature made in the image of God. The quality or character of Adam's work of dominion is therefore conditioned by what it means to be a person, to work personally, or to work out of a personal mode. The implications here are vast, so I will limit my remarks only to those few points that are relevant to our question as to the content of Adam's work. Adam's personhood follows from the dynamic sense of his being made in the image of God. To be a person, in other words, means to be a being in relation, constituted at once by a receptive quality before reality and a capacity or quality to take up what one receives in a unique personal mode. Being in person that thus entails a recognition of the gift-like character of the reality outside of myself. It's being for me, while simultaneously recognizing that what reality gives me is me. I myself am the gift of a personal reception of being. A person, in other words, cannot stand before the world and the question of his work or his task in that world with indifference. An exercise of personal dominion excludes the possibility of looking upon my work as merely something I do, as though from a discrete managerial distance. In this direction lies the temptation towards domination, a view that stems from my viewing myself as being in competition or set against the world, of it either being a threat or a potential resource. Rather, the dominion of a person is intrinsically a dominion in love. Such work enters quite naturally into a deferential role as protector and guardian, precisely because every work in service of the world's fruition and greater excellence is an improvement and intensification of my own gift-like character that is me. The work of dominion, to put the matter simply, is first constituted by a disposition of wonder. Wonder before the world, born from the revelation that it is from this reality that I receive myself as a gift, a fruit born then of mutual exchange and reciprocal self-giving, i.e., I'm a fruit of love. The orientation of such work, rather than being towards some virtual ideal space carved outside of the limitations of creation, would rather be radically world-oriented, just as the contents of this work would be the increased intensification of this reality, and specifically every effort to accentuate the world's gift-like character, its beauty. Reconceived under the aspect of their gift-like quality, the plain, everyday objects of my day-to-day life are transposed into something luminescent, laden and filled, as it were, with personal meaning. Consider, for example, what happens when a small token or thing, a ring perhaps, is exchanged between a lover and her beloved as a symbol of their mutual affection. This object remains plain, what it was before, yet in the context of love is transfigured in their eyes. It becomes something sacred for them, something special. And because of what they receive from it as a token of their love, both willfully give themselves to its sanctity, to its growth, to its beauty, allowing themselves to be beholden to this cherished thing that they share. Note, however, that as a revelation of personal meaning, which is to say that the beauty of this ring is a gift to be received by me, this vision as to the splendor of the thing does not render me inert, as though making me the one who is dominated. Rather, it is precisely the beauty of the thing, its being drawn up more intensely into the reciprocating economy of love and exchange, that confirms it as a gift from my own dynamic sense, that own part of me that makes me in the image of God. I am, as it were, by this object invited to receive it again and again with ever-increasing devotion and intensity. It is here, perhaps, that we get the closest to unearthing the symbolic or spiritual meaning of the word dominion. However, it requires that we enter into the order of paradox. For dominion, in this sense, rather than what we imagine it as a kind of strength or power, rather presents itself to view as a form of pathos, a willingness to suffer for the sake of love. For it is by my sacrificial disposition to work for the sake of the world and its beauty that I hold its nature as a gift of love, and thus uphold myself in my own dignity as the recipient of love. Adam, in this sense, receives the quality of his dominion directly from God himself. It is the very incarnation of the divine disposition towards creation that is played out in his earthly mode. And so too do we, as Christians, see this same paradoxical convergence of authority and suffering in the mode of our own work, received from Christ, whose dominion follows the pattern described by Paul, who, though he was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be exploited, but emptied himself, taking the form of a slave. Born in human likeness and found in human shape, he humbled himself, becoming obedient unto death, even death on a cross. A symbolic reading of dominion here yields a surprising adjustment of its purely objective sense. For rather than the initial indicated subordination of created realities to human interests that remain detached or abstracted from the world, there is now a subordination of human interests that well up from within the human involvement in creation, that arises, in other words, from our immersing ourselves and indeed investing oneself with the question of the reality of things, what a tree is, what wood is, and allowing, in particular, the mediation of their physical realities for setting the bounds of this encounter. This still remains a dominion in the objective sense, only now the interest that man subordinates the world to is the world's own flourishing, its own growth and cultivation. For this is what secures man's personal being as a being given for the ever fuller, ever greater maturation of what lies outside of himself. Thus, it is in our further immersing ourselves in the interests of creative things, their natures, their ends, their purposes, of their being gifts of creatures made in love, that our own gift-like character comes greater and greater into relief, working then as a working for the world's ever greater beauty. Genesis records this working for beauty being taken up in a rather unexpected and strange way, with Adam's first task in the world being the naming of animals in search of a partner or helpmate. Genesis 2:18 begins this narrative with God saying, "It is not good that man should be alone. I will make him a helper as his partner." But then strangely goes about this task in a rather indirect way. God goes about forming animals of the fields and the birds of the air, bringing them to the man to see what he would call them. Adam then gives names to all the cattle and to the birds of the air and to every animal of the field. Yet in the end, all of his efforts prove futile. His work of naming appears inadequate to bring about the thing which he sought. There is a great deal of disquieting and mysterious packed into this very short episode, not the least of which is God describing the singular human being, the recipient of his divine image, as not good. God then assigning man a task he knows from the outset is impossible, and then the extremity of Adam's failure in contrast to God's interceding work of fashioning Eve, a work, moreover, where Adam is rendered so passive as to almost appear to us as depersonalized, as God works upon Adam's unconscious body, almost strikes us as a kind of violation or manipulation. Lest the details of this episode overturn everything we've said so far, we must strive urgently to interpret this passage against its broader symbolic backdrop. Naming, to be sure, is an exercise of power, a way of placing the material things and a phenomena outside of myself under a conceptual or spiritual authority. To name a thing is to proclaim that one knows something about that thing, that some knowledge has entered into my possession and is now subject to my creative purposes and designs. Once again, however, this material reading of the principle of naming stands to be conditioned by its broader symbolic backdrop. Pageau is helpful here, orienting us to those prior realities in the Genesis account in which Adam's naming bear reference, namely to God's addressing the order of creation, much in the same way by speaking their names, as it were, and their coming into existence. But Pageau also detects a more proximate reference in the second account of creation, which records Adam being formed from the dust of the earth and then being filled by the animating ruha, or wind, of God's spiritual breath. Pageau points out that in a Hebrew symbolic economy, there is a close connection between these actions of speaking, breathing, and naming. more than a strictly materialist reading might suppose at first glance. Each of these reflect ways in which spiritual meaning, or wisdom, interacts with the material cosmos. For almost the entirety of the ancient world, the acts of speaking or naming, which flow, as it were, from one's inner breath, was always an act understood as being accompanied by the interceding presence of the supernatural. The exchange between spirit and matter was always first and foremost a divine event, a supernatural occurrence, a moment in which angels or other divine messengers worked to facilitate this exchange and encounter between matter and spirit. As far as naming then remains a kind of power over a thing, it is first and foremost an instance of reception, a material utterance forth that is simultaneously a spiritual breathing in, such that by naming the truth and goodness of a thing, that thing comes to reside in the hollow space left in the wake of my utterance. Adam names each animal, in other words, in such a way as their form or intellectual, spiritual identities come to reside in him, and in him in such a way as to take up a new life that corresponds to Adam's interiority. A name, in this sense, is not a dictation. It does not ascribe to a thing some preconceived definition, but is rather more akin to a kind of proclamation, declaring how a thing has come to reside in the life of my mind, my imagination, my creativity. This symbolic understanding for the work of naming helps guard against any kind of model of conceptual control, or of language being merely the conventional work by which human beings assign linguistic symbols to things arbitrarily so that we might manipulate them to our ends. I find Pajot here quite helpful in highlighting this broader symbolic context. However, even within Pajot's spiritual perspective, it remains difficult to see how Adam's giving them names remains anything but superfluous and ineffectual when compared to the depth and scope of their reality as creatures of God. After all, Adam's naming the animals does nothing to affect or adjust their natures, nor is it even clear what the assigning of certain phonetic or linguistic symbols, C-O-W, cow, adds to our understanding them and receiving them in the mind. The act of naming seems almost trivial, insignificant, unimportant, when compared to the depth of the mystery that one is encountering. A point perhaps only further accentuated by the fact that everything that we encounter in the world is entirely indifferent to our naming them. And indeed, if they knew why we name them, they might feel quite otherwise. For it's precisely in our capacity to look upon a tree and name it wood that we can then convince ourselves that this is merely a dumb object upon which I can work, and that I can open this reality to an infinite number of other possibilities and turn that tree into a board, a chair, or a piece of paper. Something, however, that Pajot fails to account for is that in a spiritual economy of meaning, the significance of symbols is conditioned both by those realities that precede them, in this case speaking and breathing, but also by what later surpasses them by way of their fulfillment. Therein is, in other words, a common mistake made in the interpretation of Genesis that fails to consider the work of naming as it is later conditioned by Adam's reception of Eve. Just as speaking and breathing were directed, as it were, beyond themselves in the order of making, so too is Adam's work in naming the animals directed towards his naming of Eve. The nature of the work changes, precisely because the agent or subject of the work has changed. Yes, Adam is the agent doing the naming in both accounts. But the point is that between these two accounts, Adam, the personal subject of the work, does not remain the same. He is changed in his encounter with Eve, so that a previously unrecognized dimension of his personal being suddenly is brought to light, and thus conditions the work that he does. He goes from one who was alone into one whose identity and meaning is now discovered in one beyond himself, in another. What Adam perceives in Eve is utterly surprising and arresting. For it is the difference that she bears to him by her body, combined with the perception of her equality to him in spirit, by which Adam comes to receive as his very own something that was prior to this moment an impossibility, something that lay forever beyond his grasp as a creature. For what God gives Adam by way of Eve, and vice versa, is the holy, gratuitous gift of one who can receive him wholly, and thus one who can take up the whole of Adam's dynamic self, the whole striving of his being at work, the very word of his effort, and it finds new life in her, a genuine accomplishment, a gift that arises outside of himself in the world. That is her personal gift to him. This astounding transposition of Adam's subjectivity and character is recorded in his response upon first seeing Eve, a text that disguises something altogether remarkable. This, at last, is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken from man. Perhaps amongst the most stirring passages of all of Scripture, Adam's bestowing Eve with the name woman. But here, this name is commonly misinterpreted in a reductive materialist sense, as referring simply to Adam's conceptual acknowledgement of the likeness and difference that Eve bears towards himself. Underappreciated, however, in this reading is that woman, of course, is not Eve's name, nor is it some abstract categorization. Rather, in the interplay between the Hebrew isha, woman, and ish, an entirely new manner of relationship emerges. For Adam does not so much as name this new being woman, as he in fact renounces his right to do so. He willfully renders himself into that passive stupor that God had previously placed him in, taking up rather the work of a pure sacrifice, in which he gives his own name to her, Ish. Born from a recognition that it is only in surrendering myself in a pure selfless gift of love that I can fulfill that most ardent desire to be filled outside of myself by one who can receive me. He gives his name to her. With Eve, Adam receives a reply to the hope that has always been an aspect of his efforts in naming, of his work, that not only might he name those things outside of himself, but that his name, what of himself he lends to those realities by his efforts, might indeed inhere in them and be taken up as to have the love that he holds for them there, indwell and enliven them. Even this sense is the provision or promise of God's drawing both man and woman into the very act of his creation. They become, through each other, co-creators or participants in creation, finding in work a dignity that arises not only from their being the subjects of love, but also the joy of becoming love's architects and authors. Somewhat more shortly, I'll deal with these two final symbols of garden and tree. This achievement or point of culmination in the encounter between Adam and Eve is given all the more significance when considered in light of our two final symbolic sites of meaning, specifically the imagery of the garden and that of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Fundamental here is that each of these are subordinate symbols, both together serving to further illuminate and preserve the centrality of the primary symbol, which remains that of the relationship between man and woman. The garden, the tree, serve the symbolic imagery of man and woman. That's why they're placed there. Gardens and trees, in their objective material sense, are in this case each symbols of divine provision, something given in support and protection of what God has already accomplished. Yet, even as subordinate symbols, they are no less essential. For they indicate Adam and Eve's being the site of a dynamic reception. In their supplementary sense, these symbols communicate the need of human work to be continually sustained by divine provision. It is by their very nature as additions and their deference to remaining a source of a future gift rather than an immediate possession that secures the gift-like character of both the individual and shared existence of their two recipients, the man and the woman. The symbols of garden and tree are thus intertwined, such that the corruption of one would take on a cosmic significance, effectively terminating the support upon which the entire order of creation requires for its vitality and life. In the first place, then, garden and tree are symbols of divine presence. The garden, in the account of Genesis, is widely acknowledged by contemporary biblical scholars as a type of the later temple, a place of divine presence, but also a refuge and safety. And so too is the symbolism of the tree closely tied to that of divine protection throughout the rest of Scripture, with the fruit and shade provided by the tree being a constant point of reference in Scripture as a point where the wearied and hungry traveler come into the shade and nourishment of a divine providence. Yet, from the perspective of their symbolic participation, the symbol of garden also carries another essential sense that is perhaps more obvious in its unity with the imagery of the tree. The fathers of the Church, who lived and imbibed Scripture from within the sacramental and symbolic understanding, did not hesitate to associate imagery found in the Old Testament with the archetypes of its fulfillment in the New. Thus, whenever trees were made reference to in the Old Testament, the fathers made an immediate association with another tree, namely the tree of Christ, the cross, and thus interpreted the original image through the lens of death, sacrifice, and the prospect or provision of our redemption. Redemption, of course, fits within this symbolic imagery of provision, though we're perhaps more tentative and less sure as to if this tree in this garden does indeed bear the sense of sacrifice. Even if we accept that the garden is a type of temple, temples are places of sacrifice too, still we have this suspicion or this inclination that we do not want to associate these realities with that of sacrifice, which for us means pain, death, deprivation. Yet, at the same time, I would propose that anyone accustomed to the work of gardening, unlike Bacon, may in fact arrive at a similar pointed intuition. For the gardener knows just how much of his craft is tied up in the principles of self-sacrifice and exchange, an economy, yes, of death and decay, but also of life that arises from the mutual contribution of so many sources. Indeed, when interpreted against the backdrop of an ancient symbolic worldview, the association between a garden and a site of sacrifice is not as far-fetched as it would first seem, seen as it is in the lives of plants and animals, in which the cosmic rotations of waxing and waning, day and night, life and decay, death and resurrection find their concrete expression. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which is to say life and its deprivation, carries this meaning plainly and is at the center of this garden. It is a kind of transparent or plain symbol, as though a divine effort to make the meaning of this place as obvious as possible, that the dignity of Adam and Eve, and indeed the entire cosmic order, is sustained by a principle of sacrifice, that of Adam and Eve's willingness to receive their reality from divine provision, rather than to violate this by taking it up and possessing it for themselves. Indeed, to do so would reflect a titanic work of hubris, an effort to remake oneself, each other, and one's world in some image other than that of God's design, a circumstance in which the genuine character of human work in its most original sense and the reason behind it would all but entirely become obscured. What was this original image of work offered to man but rejected? Human work was meant to unfold within the mystery of that original society of the family, in the mutual exchange and self-giving that arises from the economy of love between man and woman. For in this context, work is reconceived as a kind of prayer, an effort or activity expressed outwardly, but then suspended as a kind of hiatus in which one waits in particular for a response of being heard or received. Work too in this context is shown as a kind of offering, a surrendering, a letting go of what one does as a gift of love for another, resting in a hope forged by faith and the reassurance of God's past interventions in history that awaits expectantly the much longed for word and reply. Yes. Yes. I will love this thing that you have given me, and we will take it up together. And through our love, we will engender it into ever more beautiful and greater reiterations. This work, conditioned by the relationship of exchange and mutual self-gift between Adam and Eve, is of course then only a foretaste of the provision of the sacrifice that God himself would work to provide. And here at last we come into view of how work involves our participation in God. For it that becomes God's work to draw the words of our labor into his own, so that they may be joined to him eternally and become the works of the life of the Blessed Trinity itself, of the Son's waiting in prayerful silence of how his gift of self might be taken up ever anew, evermore, in the mutual exchange between Father and Spirit. Work, thus called unto service for the beautiful, finds unexpectedly its fullness of dignity and a capacity to, with God, engender in the beautiful, becoming participants in the very life of God through the prayerful offering of ever new creative things, for whose beauty we willingly sacrifice ourselves, and thus upholding them as something worthy of the name of creation, worthy to be taken up and divinized as objects and works of eternal affections. I'd like to conclude with a final quote here by Cyprian Norwood. Beauty exists to awe us into work, and work exists to raise us from the dead. How is it that we're raised from the dead? Through availing our work to the work of redemption. And thus perhaps it is no surprise that amongst the first, not the first, but the earliest of imagery for our Lord was a title given to him with reference to Genesis 1 in the garden. Jesus, our apple tree. Thank you.